I'll never forget the look on his face that night. My son Jacob stood up at the Christmas dinner table, his chair screeching against the hardwood floor, every eye turning toward him. His voice didn't shake, his hands didn't tremble. He looked right at me, calm but cold, and said words I'll carry with me to my grave. "Dad, we had a family meeting. We voted, and you are no longer a member of this family." The fork slipped from my hand and clattered against the plate, the sound far louder than it should have been. For a moment I thought I had misheard him. No father, no parent, expects their own child to say something like that. My wife, Linda, sat stiffly beside me, her eyes fixed on the roasted ham at the center of the table, as if it could save her from having to pick a side. My daughter, Emily, only 16, shrank into her chair, her wide eyes darting between me and her brother like she was watching a car accident happen in slow motion. And my mother, Jacob's grandmother, Margaret, covered her mouth with her trembling hands. She looked at me with eyes full of sorrow, but she said nothing. No one said a word. The silence was deafening. I could hear the faint crackle of the fire in the living room, the muffled sound of carolers on the TV, the ticking of the old grandfather clock. But inside me, it felt like the world had gone completely still. I stared at Jacob, my son, my firstborn, the boy I had held in my arms 20 years ago, swaddled in a hospital blanket, tiny fists clenching and unclenching as I promised him I'd never let him down. And now, here he was, standing tall, declaring to me, to the family, to the world, that I was no longer worthy of being called his father. He didn't hesitate. He didn't blink. He just stood there with this strange, fierce pride on his face, as though banishing me was something noble. My chest tightened, and for a second I couldn't breathe. I should have been furious. I should have slammed my fist against the table, demanded an explanation, shouted back at him. But instead, I felt something else rising inside me, something colder, calmer. I smiled. It wasn't the smile of a man who was amused. It wasn't the smile of someone who had given up either. It was the smile of someone who had been waiting for this moment, because as much as those words tore into me, I wasn't caught off guard. Not really. I reached slowly into the inside pocket of my jacket. My heart pounded as I felt the stiff edges of the envelope beneath my fingers. I had brought it with me that night, not knowing for certain if I would use it, but sensing that maybe, just maybe, this Christmas would be the one where everything came to a head. Jacob's eyes narrowed as he saw me pull it out. The others glanced nervously at each other, confused, tense, bracing for whatever came next. I set the envelope down on the table, sliding it toward Jacob with deliberate calm. My voice, when I finally spoke, was steady, almost gentle. "If that's how you feel, son, then I suppose this is goodbye. Here's a gift for you. A parting gift." The room froze. Emily gasped softly. My mother whispered my name under her breath like a prayer. Linda's eyes finally lifted from the table, full of something unreadable, guilt, maybe, or fear. But Jacob didn't flinch. He reached out, grabbed the envelope, and ripped it open. I leaned back in my chair, my hands folded, my face unreadable. But inside, my chest was a storm. Every second stretched on like an eternity. Every heartbeat thundered in my ears. As Jacob pulled out the contents and unfolded them, I saw his expression shift. First, confusion, then disbelief, then something else. Something raw and unguarded that I hadn't seen in him for years. His confident posture wavered. His fingers began to tremble. His lips parted, but no words came out. And that's when I knew. I had just shattered his world. Christmas had always been my favorite time of year. The lights strung across the porch, the smell of pine needles from the tree, the sound of carols drifting through the radio. Everything about it once filled me with a sense of warmth and belonging. But that year, sitting at the table with my family, I felt like a guest in my own home. The dining room was beautiful, almost too beautiful. My wife Linda had outdone herself, as always. The table was draped in a red and gold cloth. Candles flickered in the center. and the ham glistened under the soft chandelier light. Platters of mashed potatoes, green beans, and stuffing were arranged with magazine-like precision. From the outside, anyone walking in would have thought we were the perfect family gathering to celebrate the perfect holiday. But if you looked closer, you'd notice the small cracks. Linda barely spoke to me anymore. She moved gracefully between the kitchen and the dining room, refilling glasses and adjusting dishes, but she did it without ever meeting my eyes. When she sat down, she angled her chair slightly toward the kids, as though to put another inch of distance between us. She wasn't cruel, not openly, but the distance between us was loud enough to drown out the carols playing faintly in the background. My daughter, Emily, 16, sat across from me. She fiddled with the hem of her red sweater, her long hair falling across her face as she avoided looking up. Emily used to be my shadow. When she was little, she'd follow me into the garage, asking endless questions as I worked on projects. But lately, whenever I tried to talk to her, she'd retreat into silence. She still loved me, I knew that. But she was caught in the middle of a family that felt divided in ways a teenager shouldn't have to navigate. And then there was my son Jacob. 20 years old, home from college, brimming with ideas, opinions, and a kind of righteous energy I both admired and feared. He had always been bold, unafraid to speak his mind, but somewhere along the way that boldness turned sharp. He saw me less as a father and more as a symbol of everything he resented: my long hours at work, my mistakes, the times I wasn't there when he needed me. To him, I wasn't just flawed, I was a failure. He sat tall at the head of the table, opposite me, as though he were already rehearsing for the role he was about to claim. His jaw was set, his eyes heavy with something colder than teenage rebellion. I could feel it, like static in the air before a storm. And then, of course, there was my mother, Margaret. At 73, she still carried herself with dignity, her silver hair pulled back neatly, her hands folded on her lap. She had always been my anchor, the woman who raised me after my father died young, who worked 2 jobs to keep food on the table, who taught me the value of responsibility. Now she sat quietly, watching her family fracture before her eyes, powerless to stop it. I tried to pretend everything was normal. I asked Emily about school, Jacob about finals, Linda about the casserole. Their answers were clipped, polite, rehearsed. It felt less like a family dinner and more like a performance, each of us playing a role we no longer believed in. Inside, I wrestled with my own guilt. I wasn't blind to why things had turned out this way. Years of 12-hour workdays had kept me away from home more than I cared to admit. I had missed Jacob's championship basketball game, Emily's first choir recital, countless dinners, birthdays, and quiet moments that mattered more than I realized at the time. I told myself I was working for them, for the house, the tuition, the security. But what good was security if it built walls instead of bridges? I looked around the table, trying to catch anyone's eye, searching for some sign that there was still a place for me among them. But Linda avoided me. Emily stared down at her plate. Jacob glanced at me only with thinly veiled contempt. My mother met my gaze once, her expression soft but weary, as though she knew something was coming but couldn't find the strength to intervene. I cut into my ham, forced a smile, and told myself to hold it together. This was Christmas, a time for family, for peace, for grace. I wanted to believe we could get through one evening without the tension boiling over. But deep down, I knew better. The air was too thick with unspoken words, too heavy with years of resentment and regret. It wasn't a matter of if the storm would break, it was only a matter of when. And when it did, it wouldn't just be raised voices or slammed doors, it would be final. I had come prepared, though. In the pocket of my jacket, I felt the stiff rectangle of the envelope pressing against my chest, a reminder that I had made a choice before I ever sat down at that table. I didn't know what the night would bring, but I knew one thing for certain. This Christmas dinner would not end like the others. It happened just as I was cutting into the ham. One moment, the room was filled with the clinking of silverware and the polite murmurs of forced conversation, and the next, Jacob's chair screeched across the floor as he stood up. The sound was sharp enough to silence the table instantly. I looked up, my knife poised in midair, and saw him holding his glass as if he were about to make a toast. His posture was stiff, his jaw set, his eyes locked on me with an intensity that made the hair on my arm stand up. "Can I have everyone's attention?" Jacob said, his voice louder than it needed to be. Linda froze, her hand tightening around her fork. Emily glanced nervously between us. My mother slowly lowered her napkin from her lips, her eyes narrowing with unease. Jacob took a deep breath, then delivered the words that cut deeper than any blade. "Dad, we had a family meeting, we voted, and you are no longer a member of this family." For a second, I thought my heart had stopped. The words hung in the air like smoke, heavy and suffocating. The first sound that followed was the clatter of my fork as it slipped from my fingers and hit the plate. Emily gasped and covered her mouth. My mother whispered, "Jacob," as though saying his name might undo what he had just spoken. But Jacob didn't falter. His voice grew sharper, fueled by years of bottled resentment. "You don't get it, Dad. You've been absent for years. You think working long hours and paying the bills makes you a father? It doesn't. We needed you at home, but you were always gone. You missed my games, Emily's recitals, Mom's struggles, and when you were here, it was like you weren't really present. We've all talked about it, we've all felt it, and we've decided we're done pretending this is a family when you're in it." Each word hit like a hammer. My son wasn't just angry, he was rehearsed. This wasn't a spontaneous outburst, this was planned, deliberate. I turned to Linda, searching her face for denial, for some sign that this wasn't true, but she looked down at her plate, her lips pressed tight, her silence more damning than any words could be. "Linda?" I asked, my voice cracking despite myself. She didn't look at me, she didn't defend me, she didn't say a word. I shifted my gaze to Emily. Tears welled in her eyes, and she shook her head slowly, whispering, "I didn't vote. I swear I didn't." Her voice trembled, desperate to distance herself from Jacob's cruelty. But Jacob cut her off sharply. "Emily, don't." We all agreed. "You said you were tired of Dad's excuses, too." Emily flinched as though he had slapped her. My stomach twisted. My son was using his sister, twisting her words to strengthen his case. My mother finally spoke, her voice sharp for the first time all evening. "Jacob Rourke, how dare you speak to your father this way? He's the reason you have a roof over your head. He's the reason you're even in college." But Jacob snapped back, his voice rising. "And what did it cost, Grandma, his family? What's the point of college or a nice house if he was never here to be our dad?" The room erupted into chaos. Emily cried silently into her napkin. My mother scolded Jacob through angry tears. Linda whispered, "Please, not tonight." Her tone hollow, not directed at anyone in particular. And I sat there, frozen. Inside me, two battles raged. One part of me wanted to stand, to scream, to remind my son of the nights I worked through exhaustion so he'd never go hungry, the sacrifices I made in silence. But the other part of me, the heavier, quieter part, knew Jacob wasn't entirely wrong. I had failed in ways I could never undo. But this wasn't just anger, this was exile. My own family had held a secret meeting, cast their votes, and declared me unworthy of a place at my own table. The humiliation burned hotter than the fireplace. My face flushed. My hands tightened into fists beneath the tablecloth. I looked around at the people I loved most in this world, and for the first time, I felt like an intruder in my own home. Jacob stood tall, victorious in his declaration. He thought he had broken me. But what he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I had come to this dinner prepared for something exactly like this. I reached into the pocket of my jacket and felt the envelope waiting there, cool and firm against my palm. I took a breath, steadying myself. If my son thought he could erase me from this family, he was about to learn something that would shake him to his core. I sat there in the middle of the chaos, my family unraveling around me. Jacob glared down at me with the arrogance of a man who thought he had won, while my mother scolded him through angry tears and Emily tried to disappear into her napkin. Linda said nothing, her silence louder than any outburst. I felt the rage boiling in my chest, the urge to slam my fist on the table and shout until the walls shook. But instead of exploding, something inside me went still, like the calm eye of a storm. I straightened my back, inhaled slowly, and slid my hand into the inside pocket of my jacket. My fingers found the envelope I had placed there hours earlier. For weeks, I had wrestled with the decision of whether to bring it. Something told me I would need it, though I never could have imagined the moment would unfold this way. The room quieted as they saw me reach into my coat. Jacob narrowed his eyes, suspicious, as if he expected me to pull out a speech or maybe a pathetic apology. Linda shifted in her chair, finally looking at me with a flicker of unease. My mother's gaze softened, and Emily, still sniffling, peeked up through her tears. I laid the envelope on the table in front of me. I didn't push it forward immediately. I let it sit there, its white edges stark against the festive tablecloth. The weight of it seemed to press down on the room. Then I looked directly at Jacob. "If that's truly how you feel," I said, my voice calm and steady, "then I suppose this is goodbye. But before you wash your hands of me completely, I have something for you." I slid the envelope across the table toward him. Jacob scoffed. "What is this supposed to be, some kind of bribe, another excuse?" I shook my head slowly. "It's a gift. One last gift from me to you." The words seemed to hang in the air, heavier than they should have been. I could see Jacob's confidence falter for just a moment, but then he smirked, trying to mask his hesitation. "Fine," he said, snatching up the envelope. "Let's see what the great dad has left us this time." The sound of the paper tearing open seemed impossibly loud. I folded my hands on the table, forcing myself to remain still, though inside my heart was pounding hard enough to rattle my ribs. All eyes were on Jacob. Linda's lips parted slightly, her breath catching as though she sensed the moment mattered more than she wanted to admit. Emily clutched the edge of the table, her face pale and wet with tears. My mother leaned forward, whispering under her breath, "Michael, what have you done?" Jacob pulled out the folded papers inside. He glanced at them quickly at first, expecting some meaningless gesture. But then he slowed. His smirk faded. His eyes flicked across the page again, more carefully this time. I watched the exact moment confusion turned into shock. His posture stiffened. His breathing grew shallow. What is this?" he asked, his voice suddenly stripped of its bravado. I leaned forward slightly, my tone soft but cutting. "That, Jacob, is the deed to your grandfather's cabin by the lake. He wanted you to have it someday when I believed you were ready. I signed it over to you. It's yours now." The room fell silent. The crackling fire in the next room seemed louder than ever. Jacob's hands trembled as he held the papers. His face, usually so composed, cracked under the weight of realization. He looked younger in that moment, more like the little boy who once begged me to take him fishing at that very cabin. You're giving this to me?" he whispered. I nodded. "Yes, Merry Christmas, son." His jaw worked as though he wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. He looked at me, truly looked at me, for the first time in years, and I saw something in his eyes I hadn't seen in so long. Vulnerability. Emily sniffled loudly, her tears spilling fresh as she whispered, "Dad." Her voice was full of awe, not accusation. My mother pressed a hand to her heart, her lips quivering. Even Linda couldn't hide the flicker of shock that crossed her face. I kept my expression calm, but inside my emotions churned like a storm. Anger, grief, pride, and heartbreak all tangled together. This wasn't revenge. It wasn't manipulation. It was love. The kind of love that hurts. The kind of love that demands sacrifice, even when it isn't deserved. Jacob's fingers shook harder. He clutched the deed like it might slip through his hands, and for the first time all evening, he had nothing to say. Jacob stared at the papers in his hands as if they were written in another language. His lips parted, his chest rose and fell in uneven breaths, and the swagger that had carried him into this confrontation seemed to drain from his body all at once. The room, moments earlier, filled with tension and raised voices, now sank into an almost unbearable silence. The only sounds were the faint ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway and the crackling of the fire in the living room. Even the clinking of silverware had stopped. No one dared move. His hands trembled violently. The deed shook with them, the paper crinkling under the strain. I don't understand," Jacob whispered finally. His voice was hoarse, stripped of the confidence and bravado he had just wielded like a weapon. I leaned forward, my elbows resting on the edge of the table, and looked directly into his eyes. For the first time that evening there was no anger in me, no sharp edge to my tone, only truth. "You've always loved that cabin," I said softly. "Every summer, every holiday, you begged me to take you there. You'd fish off the dock until the sun went down. You'd sit on the porch with your grandfather, listening to his stories. That cabin was the one place you seemed happiest. Your grandfather wanted it to stay in the family. He wanted it to be yours someday. So I signed it over to you." Jacob blinked rapidly, his throat working as if he were swallowing back a flood of emotions. You gave this to me? After everything I said to you?" "Yes." My voice cracked slightly, but I steadied it. "Because you're my son. And even if you don't see me as family anymore, nothing will ever change that I see you as mine." Emily let out a sob, unable to contain herself. She pushed back her chair, stood up, and circled the table to throw her arms around me. Her body shook as she buried her face against my shoulder. "Dad, I'm so sorry," she whispered through tears. My mother, Margaret, sat rigid in her chair, her eyes glistening. She pressed her trembling hands together as if in prayer, whispering under her breath, "Thank you, Lord, thank you." But Linda, my wife, just stared at the scene with a mixture of disbelief and discomfort. She looked at Jacob, then at me, as though she couldn't quite process what was unfolding. Jacob's lips quivered. His bravado was gone. His face flushed red, then pale. He opened his mouth, but no words came. He looked down at the deed again, his hands still shaking. For the first time in years, he looked small to me. Not because he was weak, but because he was vulnerable. "Why?" he finally managed to whisper. His voice broke on the single word. I let out a long breath. "Because sometimes love means giving, even when it isn't earned. Because I wanted you to know that I was still thinking about you, still believing in you, even when you thought I wasn't there. This cabin, it's not just property, it's memories, it's responsibility, it's legacy, and now it's yours." The tears came then. He didn't sob or wail, but his eyes filled and overflowed. One drop fell onto the deed, smearing the ink slightly where his thumb pressed against the page. His shoulders hunched, his breath shaky. For years, he had built a wall between us, brick by brick, anger, disappointment, resentment. And in a single moment, with a single act, I had found a way to put a crack in that wall. Jacob lowered himself back into his chair, his head bowed, the deed still clutched in his trembling hands. His voice was barely audible when he spoke again. "Dad, I don't deserve this." I reached across the table, my hand hovering near his. "Maybe not, but sometimes we don't get what we deserve. Sometimes we get what we need, and I believe you need this, Jacob." He looked up at me then, his eyes red, his voice caught somewhere between shame and gratitude. I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything, I told him quietly. Just take care of it and remember who gave it to you. The weight of the moment pressed down on the entire table. Even Linda, silent until now, dabbed at her eyes with the corner of her napkin, though she tried to hide it. The family that had moments ago voted me out now sat frozen in the wake of a single gesture that none of them had expected. Jacob wasn't the same in that moment. His pride was shattered, his anger disarmed. He sat there with trembling hands, clutching the gift I had given him, realizing that no matter how far he tried to push me away, I had never stopped being his father. And though he didn't say the words, I could feel them lingering in the silence between us. Forgive me. The cabin deed still sat in Jacob's trembling hands when the weight of the evening finally settled on all of us. His confidence had evaporated, replaced by shame and vulnerability. Emily clung to my arm, her quiet sobs muffled against my shoulder. My mother dabbed at her eyes with the corner of her napkin, whispering prayers under her breath. And Linda sat frozen, her fork untouched, her face pale. She looked from Jacob to me, then down at the table, as though she wasn't sure which side of this family battle she belonged to anymore. No one spoke for what felt like an eternity. The Christmas candles flickered. The grandfather clock ticked. The ham on the table grew cold. I finally broke the silence. "Listen," I said softly, my voice carrying more weight than volume. "I know I wasn't the father you wanted me to be. I know I failed you more times than I can count, but family isn't about keeping score. It's about love, and love isn't something you vote on." Jacob's head dropped lower, the papers shaking in his grip. His lips pressed into a thin line, and though he didn't speak, I could see his pride battling his guilt. Emily pulled back from me, her cheeks wet, and glared at her brother. "How could you say that to Dad? How could you even think it?" Her voice cracked, but her anger was real. Jacob winced. For once, he didn't argue. He didn't throw her words back at her. He simply sat there, the weight of the deed anchoring him to his chair. My mother leaned forward, her voice strong again. "Michael's right, family isn't perfect. Lord knows we all fall short. But you don't just cast someone out. Blood is blood, Jacob, and one day, when you're older, you'll understand what your father has given you tonight." Jacob looked up at me then. His eyes were red, his face pale, and for the first time since he was a boy, he seemed unsure of himself. "Dad," his voice was a whisper, "I don't deserve this. I don't deserve you." I shook my head slowly. "It's not about deserving, son. It never was. It's about love, even when it hurts. Especially when it hurts." He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. His fingers tightened around the deed, crumpling the edges slightly. Then, with a shaky breath, he whispered the words I had longed to hear for years. "I'm sorry." They weren't loud, they weren't grand, but they were real. Emily cried harder, covering her mouth. My mother whispered, "Thank you, Lord," again, her tears spilling freely. And even Linda, my silent, distant wife, closed her eyes and let out a sigh, as though the dam inside her had finally cracked. But I didn't rush to hug Jacob. I didn't leap across the table or demand anything from him. I simply nodded and said, "Thank you." Because forgiveness isn't about erasing the past. It's about opening the door for a different future. The rest of the dinner was quiet. No one ate much. The tension had shifted, not vanished. But something had changed. A wall had cracked. A seed had been planted. Later, as I put on my coat by the door, Jacob approached me. He still held the envelope, folded clumsily in his pocket. His voice was steadier, though still soft. "Dad," he said, hesitating, "I'll take care of the cabin, I promise. I'll make you proud." I placed a hand on his shoulder. For a moment I felt the boy he used to be, the one who used to run to me after scoring a basket. the one who once looked at me like I was his whole world. "You don't have to make me proud, Jacob," I told him. "Just be better than I was, that's all I've ever wanted." He nodded, his eyes wet, and then stepped back. I opened the door and stepped out into the crisp winter night. Snowflakes drifted under the streetlight, glowing like falling stars. Behind me, the house was warm and bright, but for the first time in years, I didn't feel bound by it. As I walked to my car, I thought about what had happened. I had been cast out, exiled by my own family. But instead of fighting fire with fire, I had chosen something else, grace, and in that choice, I had seen something break open in my son's heart. Maybe Jacob's apology wouldn't fix everything overnight. Maybe the scars of our past would always linger. But that night, at that table, I had proven something. That love, real love, isn't about who deserves what. It's about giving, even when it hurts. And as I started the engine and drove away, I whispered to myself, "Merry Christmas." Not because it had been perfect, not because it had been easy, but because in the ashes of that broken dinner, a spark of hope had finally been lit. And that was the Christmas dinner that changed my family forever. It wasn't the gifts under the tree, the food on the table, or even the argument that will stay with me the longest. It was the reminder that love isn't always about what's easy. Sometimes it's about sacrifice, grace, and showing up in ways people least expect. If this story moved you, if it made you think about your own family, or if you've ever had to give love even when it hurt, then I'd love to hear from you. Hit that like button if you enjoyed this story. Share it with someone who needs a reminder about the power of forgiveness and family. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories that grab your heart and make you think. And in the comments below, tell me, what does family mean to you? Until next time, thank you for watching, and Merry Christmas.